Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. I'm Lauren Smith with the International Franchise Association, and we have a great 30 minutes lined up for you. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that we are recording today's webinar and will make it available later this evening on community.franchise.org. If you have any questions for today's speaker, please add them to the chat box and they will be addressed toward the end. Today's topic is supplier agreements, strategies for building stronger contracts during turbulent times, and it is brought to us by Greenberg Traurig. Here to provide today's discussion is Toni Brown with Greenberg Traurig. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to Greenberg Traurig for sponsoring today's Lunch and Learn. I'll go ahead and turn things over to you, Toni.
Thank you, Lauren, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toni Brown. I'm with the Atlanta office of Greenberg Traurig, and I'd like to thank you all for joining and also thank the IFA for having me today. I specialize in assisting clients draft and negotiate commercial contracts with a focus on supply chain and distribution agreements. Now, since we've only got 30 minutes today, I'm going to try to move quickly so we can keep some time at the end for questions, but we've got a lot to cover. So to get things started, I wanted to make things a little bit interactive, right? So even though we're meeting virtually, still want to have some interaction with the group. So I wanted to start off with just a poll question. And thank you to Lauren for helping us with this. So I think Lauren's going to initiate the poll, but basically just a simple question, which I think we probably all know the answer to, but if you could click and answer whether your business has been negatively impacted by supply chain disruptions within the past 2 years. And we will give it a couple of seconds just to let you all answer. I'm going to go ahead and answer as well. Hopefully technology will be our friend today. We'll just give that a couple of seconds, and then Lauren, just let me know when it looks like we've got a good amount of responses. We can put those responses up. All right. Okay, so it looks like 80% of the group has answered yes, 20% answered no. To those 20%, consider yourselves very lucky because there have been a lot of supply chain disruptions. And what we wanted to show with this poll is that it's had a global impact. I'm sure we have representatives on the call today from multiple states in various different industries, and it's impacted us all, right? So let's get into the discussion today. Lauren, if you can go to the next slide. So today, what we're going to talk about is briefly, how did we get here? What happened to cause all these disruptions with the supply chain? Also, why do we need to focus on supply chain matters? And finally, what are some things that we can do to help counteract the negative impact of these supply chain disruptions? Next slide. So first, let's start with talking about how we got here. So I'm sure that it's no surprise to everyone on the call today that, there was a little thing called COVID-19 that came around in 2020 and flipped our world upside down. If you recall having to worry about getting toilet tissue or how you were going to do that, thank COVID. So the pandemic wasn't the only cause of the supply chain disruption, but it was a perfect incubator for the problems to fester and multiply, right? So how did it start? So we started off, we had the pandemic and there were shutdowns. So people could not go to work. And it was the start of labor issues, right? So when things first started to open up, there were still staffing issues and staffing wasn't reliable because either people did not want to return to work or when they did, they had exposure to somebody that had COVID, or worse, they had COVID themselves. So staffing and labor became a large problem. Now, when you pile on top of that shipping container shortages, a war in Ukraine, and a just-in-time system that resulted in a lack of on-hand inventory, it's the perfect storm, right? Because you don't have the labor that's necessary to get the products out, and companies don't have a backfill of supply that they can pull from. And so the result are shortages and outages and supply chain disruptions. Next slide. So taking a look kind of at the numbers here, and what these charts show is over the past several years, kind of the number and level of supply chain disruptions. Now, legal disclaimer, this information was gathered using artificial intelligence, and it's not a full representation of all companies or all disruptions, but what it does show is the exponential growth in supply chain disruptions between 2020 and 2021. So if you're a part of that 80% in the poll earlier that had the disruptions, you are definitely not alone. Next slide. So why is it important for us to focus on supply chain matters? The short answer is that it directly impacts a company's bottom line. And it does that in a variety of different ways. So the first is brand image and loyalty. So when a customer comes to your business, they want consistency. They want things to taste the same, or they want things to look the same. They want that experience to be consistent. And, if you're getting your products from wherever you can because you're having issues with your suppliers, then you might not always get the same thing. And that experience might not be consistent. Now, in today's world, consumers are very quick to air out their grievances to the world via social media. And so what happens with that is that it can have a negative impact on your brand image. If you're all over TikTok or Twitter because your product wasn't the same, or you go one day and you get this and you go the next day and it's a completely different experience for the same product, that can start to have a negative impact. So the next area is continuity of supply. And what that is just making sure that the products that you have available are consistently there. So just to kind of give an example, I represent several clients in the QSR food space. So one in particular, one day, I was taking my kids out to one of these restaurants that I represent just for, a quick lunch for the kids, a quick snack for myself. So at this particular restaurant, my favorite menu item is the mozzarella sticks. So we're going through the drive-through. I order the mozzarella sticks first because I'm kind of a greedy mom, and let's get my order in and then we'll order for the kids. I order the mozzarella sticks, and the cashier, she tells me over the intercom, I'm sorry, we're out of marinara sauce. For me, that's a deal breaker. I cannot eat mozzarella sticks without marinara sauce. So of course, I'm not ordering mozzarella sticks that day. So I go on to the kids. So I'm ordering their meals, 2 kids' meals. The cashier comes back over the intercom. I'm sorry, we don't have any kids' cups today. That's fine. We can still work with another cup. Just put a smaller amount in it. We're okay. So continue my order, ordered some extra ketchup on the side because my daughter likes to put ketchup on everything. So it's very important for her that she has ketchup. Cashier comes back over again. She says, you know what, I'm sorry, we're out of ketchup packets right now. I apologize. I don't know if you know, but we've been having supply chain issues. So some of our products aren't available right now. Now, to myself, in my mind, I laugh because, of course, I know I deal with it on the daily. So I definitely understand, the impact of the supply chain issues. But I say all that to say, I understand and know, but the average customer may not appreciate the complexity of supply chain issues. All they see is, I'm not getting marinara sauce, I'm not getting my mozzarella sticks today, my kid might be upset because now they don't have ketchup. So continuity of supply is very important because it can shape a person's experience at your business. The next area is quality assurance. You want to make sure that you are providing safe products to your end consumers and that the suppliers that you're working with, particularly in situations where you need to make spot purchases to cover a disruption with a primary supplier, that these replacement suppliers are conducting business in a safe and manner that is compliant with not only your company's quality standards, but applicable law. Because heaven forbid, if there is some type of quality concern, again, your brand is going to be what is consumer facing. A customer coming to your brand is not going to automatically know that the fault came from this replacement supplier. They are looking at you, and that can also impact, again, your brand image. Lastly, we've got cost of goods sold. Now, with all of the labor and supply chain issues, things have become more expensive. And it's across the board. It's not just for suppliers, it's everywhere. So, profit margins are shrinking. And with any business, you try and find that money in other areas. So you try to make up for that. And with higher costs of good, becomes less profit. So if you are having to find replacements at a higher price, or your primary suppliers are increasing the cost of their products, your profits are also going to be negatively impacted. So all of these areas, have a direct correlation to supply chain. And it's why, we do want to focus on it, and we do need to pay attention to what's going on in this area. Next slide. So what can we do? We've talked about the problems. Everybody, has experienced some type of issue or disruption, or at least is knowledgeable about the issues out there. What can we do? Now, I wish that I can give you a cheat code and say, put this in your contract, everything will be fine. Fortunately, that's not the case. I think that we're going to have to ride out this wave for a bit longer. The supply chain disruptions are not going to go away overnight. But there are things that you can and should be doing to make sure that you put your company in a more favorable position. So what does that look like? First things first, take a look at your contracts. And by that, I mean, make sure that a contract is in place, right? I don't care if you've worked with your particular supplier for 20 years now, and you've always negotiated pricing via email and been very informal. Unfortunately, the world has changed, and the days of handshake deals and being less formal are in our rearview mirror. And I think that we need to make sure that we have agreements in place that will provide your company some protection. And it's not just enough to say, oh, we signed a contract. We signed a contract 5 years ago, so we're good. Take a look. Make sure that your contract is still within the term, that it hasn't expired. If there are, expiration notices or renewal provisions, take a look to see, where exactly you're at. Also, dust off your templates. So if you don't have standard form agreements or terms and conditions, now is a great time to look into putting some of those in place, or if you already have them, taking a closer look at them. The reason being is a lot of older contracts didn't really speak to a lot of the supply chain disruption and issues that we're experiencing today, because these times are unprecedented. And so there's not a lot of remedies that you can point to in some of these older agreements. So taking a look at your forms, refreshing them, updating them is definitely going to be in your favor, particularly if you're in a position where you might be on both sides of the table, right? You might be in a situation where you are the buyer of goods, but then you also turn around and sell goods. It's important to have forms that address your position in the deal. So you might have a set of terms and conditions for situations in which you're the buyer, and a separate set of terms and conditions for situations in which you are the seller. Now, one thing to be mindful of, you want to start off strong, and starting off strong means starting with your own forms and your own paper, because preferably those are drafted in a way that are more favorable to you and your position. However, with that being said, you need to be mindful. Now, like we stated earlier, things are different. People are strained on all sides because margins are tight. The supply is tight. There are shortages. And so suppliers are already strained. You don't want to come out the gate so strong with your form documents that they're completely one-sided and off-putting. Hopefully you're in situations where you are trying to build a longer-term relationship with these suppliers. So you need to take that into consideration and be mindful of that. Understand where you might have leverage and where you might not have leverage, and where the relationship aspect might play more of a role. Now, I always say, when you're negotiating a contract or an agreement or a deal, if one side walks off completely happy with everything that they ever asked for, they've gotten, then something has gone pretty wrong. It's pretty rare that you're going to get everything on your wish list, but there are ways that you can try to build in some protections, but it's a delicate balance, and it's something that needs to be analyzed kind of on a case-by-case basis, and making sure that you are picking and choosing the areas that are of importance to you and building those into your forms, understanding that you may not get all of that, but at least you're starting off in a better position. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight some of the areas in contracts that have been brought to the forefront recently because of supply chain disruptions, and give you a little bit of advice on that, right? So that's what we're here to talk about. How do you make them stronger? So in 30 minutes, we can't kind of build out a whole contract, but we want to make sure that we at least give you some tips on that. So the first area is force majeure. And for those of you who don't speak legalese, force majeure is intended to put a pause on a contract when unforeseeable and unavoidable events occur that prevent one of the parties from being able to fulfill their obligation. Now, what I mean when I say pause is that it releases that party from liability. So if there truly is a force majeure event, the other party cannot say, hey, you're in breach of the contract because you're not fulfilling your obligations, because we put a pause on things, right? And so during the duration of that force majeure event, the party experiencing that event is they're able to kind of not have to fulfill those obligations without the threat of being in breach. Now, there's no single definition of what constitutes a force majeure event. So courts give deference to the contracts, and most contracts will include a list of items that are technically included as force majeure events for purposes of the particular agreement. Now, force majeure is not something new. It's not a concept that came up because of the supply chain disruptions or because of the pandemic. But what is new is that a lot of vendors and suppliers are trying to throw the entire kitchen sink into this litany of items that constitute a force majeure event, because essentially it's kind of like a get out of jail free card, right? It allows them to kind of put a pause on things and not have to worry about being in breach. Now, some of the things that are more typical and less problematic and what we are used to seeing in force majeure events definitions are natural disasters, fires, war or civil unrest, and floods, things that truly are outside of the control of the parties and unforeseeable events, right, to a certain extent. So, if a tornado comes and ravages an area and tears down a portion of a plant, of course, nobody is going to expect that supplier to still provide the products. They could not control that. That was completely something that was not planned. And they should have the ability to kind of rebuild and kind of get things back. What we're starting to see with force majeure events are things that aren't really unforeseeable or unavoidable. So depending on which side you are in the agreement, particularly if you're not the supplier, you want to be sure that you're being specific as to what are these true force majeure events. You don't want broad language that can be interpreted in multiple ways, because again, if you're not the supplier, that could be used against you. And you don't want to be in a situation where you're having to argue whether or not something is or is not a force majeure event and forcing the supplier to then act. So what does this look like? What have we been seeing? First and foremost, there have been a lot more references to COVID. Even still, we're still seeing references to COVID in force majeure event definitions. And COVID in and of itself, is not per se problematic. However, COVID is not really unforeseeable, right? It's something that we're all learning to live with. And so just a broad reference to just COVID can be problematic if you're not on the supplier side, because what does that mean? COVID is pretty much here to stay, at least for, the short term. So is it because COVID is still out there that a supplier can, try to claim force majeure at any time because COVID is in existence? That shouldn't be the intent. However, you don't want to leave that ambiguity. Now, if there was a situation where the government initiated new shutdowns, that's something different. So just be specific. Also, supply chain disruptions. That's another very broad statement that we're starting to see in force majeure definitions. And again, what does that mean? What is a supply chain disruption? How long does it have to last? Personally, I tend to push very hard on supply chain disruptions because we want to make sure that force majeure events are really only targeting things that are outside of the control of the other party. Now, this doesn't mean that we won't address it in other areas of the contract if necessary, but again, you don't want to give that get out of jail free card away for just anything. Next slide. replacement damages. And I'm going to try and speed up a little bit just to make sure that we have time for questions. But this is a concept that a company should be made whole in a situation where a supplier cannot provide the products for reasons other than a force majeure event, right? Because we've already said that's a pause, it's a get out of jail free. So if there's something else that caused the supplier to be unable to provide the products and a business has to go out and find a replacement supplier, which likely will be at a higher cost, right? Because you're having to do a quicker turnaround. The volumes are not going to be as high as with your primary supplier, but you need to ensure that you're getting products out to your system. What replacement damages does is it puts that burden or that obligation on the supplier to make you whole, right? So the supplier is taking on that risk for not being able to fulfill its obligations. Now, will you always get 100% of that cost back? Maybe not, but starting with something in your contract at least gives you a better bargaining position to try and figure out how to properly allocate that risk amongst the parties. Next slide. Finally, price changes. Now, I have seen here, again, when you talk about, these margins shortening and, suppliers trying to recoup these costs in different places. I've had suppliers come out and just say, hey, you know what, we're raising your price. We've got to raise your price or we can't continue to supply, regardless of what the contract might say, or they're using ambiguity in the contract as a little bit of wiggle room to get in there and raise the price. So for this, you want to make sure that you are specific. Again, trying to put yourself into a better position. It does not mean that the supplier still won't come to you and try to demand a price increase, but they may think twice before doing it to you if you have a more solid contract in place than another one of their customers that may not have language specific to this. So what does this language look like? First, you want to make sure that you expressly state in your agreement that any price changes are subject to the mutual agreement of the parties. Or if you have language in a contract that talks about the parties meeting to discuss price changes or working to agree on price changes, you want to be clear as to what happens if the parties can't agree, right? Because a lot of contracts in the past would have these provisions talking about how the parties would meet and discuss pricing and come up with something. But they didn't really speak to what happens if you don't come up with something. So you need to think about what's going to happen. Is the original pricing, does that remain in place? Or are you going to agree to kind of a fixed percentage? Also, if you can be specific on the number of percentages or the number of price increases or the amount of a particular price increase, it's helpful. It's hard to think about this and you may not want to open that door on when you're doing the negotiations, but given the problems that we've experienced with supply chain disruptions and suppliers trying to kind of force these price increases, it's something that you should consider kind of bringing up before it becomes an issue. Next slide. All right, so I have left a couple of minutes, so apologies on that, but I do want to make sure that we give some time to open it up to questions. I've seen a couple come through, and so Lauren, if you don't mind, maybe we can pick out a couple of the questions.
Yes, I see one from Lindsay. How often should you update your agreements?
Great question, Lindsay. I think it depends on your situation. So if you have agreements where you're doing more spot purchases with suppliers, meaning you don't enter into kind of agreements that have multiple annual year terms, then you would probably look at them every couple of years, right? So you don't want to be so aggressive with your reviews that you're changing things, and each time you come back to the supplier, it's a completely new form. So I would say, depending on your situation and your circumstances, probably once every couple of years is sufficient, unless you're running into a lot of the same problems. Then you might want to take a closer look at them.
Awesome. It looks like that's actually all the questions we have for today. And it actually looks like that's all the time we have for today as well. So thank you so much, Toni. This was excellent content and excellent feedback from all of you. We really do appreciate it. Again, this webinar was recorded, and along with the presentation deck will appear on our website early this evening. You'll be able to find that at community.franchise.org. Thank you very much again to Toni and to the Greenberg Traurig team. And again, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe and healthy. Bye.
Thank you, guys. And if anyone has any questions afterwards, my contact information is here. So please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.